The Meshlicious custom loop is all done, and it's been running for a few days now, so let's discuss the build, the performance, and why you might want to do such a setup. Welcome to Machines and More. Hope you all had a chance to check out the build video for this, and thanks for all the great feedback. So as kind of an example build, I set up this Meshlicious custom loop that I dubbed Tradewinds. I think the nickeled brass gives it that maritime feel about it. It's a cool ocean breeze. It's the warm sun. It's all about sitting on a yacht in the tropics, sipping on a Mai Tai and enjoying some sweet, sweet FPS, right? So let's do this. I'll talk about the build briefly, give some performance benchmarks, and then I'll wrap up with a general summary about custom loops in this case. So for this build here, I wanted to do something a little bit different than your typical clear hardline build. And the tubing here that I used is 12mm bits power brass hardline with a nickel finish. Now, because this stuff is difficult to bend, especially since it already has a finish on it, I went with a variety of fittings to make it work with just straight sections of pipe. Now, you can get pre-bent sections of pipe for this kind of thing, but it does quickly get very expensive, especially with a lot of bends. And you really do need to cut it to fit correctly, or you risk needing a brand new pre-bent section. You can cut it long and chase up slowly to the right length, but shortening things just a tiny bit does require more time with grinding or sanding down, since recutting metal tubing just a tiny amount is quite difficult. So with just straight lengths here, it was a bit more tolerant in terms of shortening. I could just go ahead and recut a shorter section of pipe when needed. There is a good bit of trial and error here, as with many custom loops, that I did have the tubing run planned out in advance, but when it actually got to piecing it together, there was a lot of fine measurement and relative dimensioning and cutting as I went along, but I think it turned out okay in the end. Bits Power Touch Aqua fittings here, along with the Alpha Cool angled fittings. On the CPU side of the house, I went with 90-degree bends, and on the GPU side, to match the angled edge of the GPU block, I went with two 45-degree angle bends here. The CPU is the Ryzen 5800X on the Asus B550 ITX, which we've been testing with, which can connect to a 10K coolant temp sensor directly, so I did mount one of those on the underside of the GPU port. The CPU is cooled by the Optimus Foundation AM4 block. GPU is the RTX 3070 FE Founders Edition card, and this one uses the EK Vector block for the card. EK's FLT 120 DDC pump, and I did throw in a flow meter over here in the bottom corner as well. You can't see it as nicely because of the solid coolant, but when it is spinning slowly, you can definitely see the meter moving. Rad here is the Hardware Labs GTS 240 with two EK X3M Vardar fans, and I went with these for the looks, but honestly, I'm not big on these fans, and there's no question if the Noctua NFA 12x25s were already available in Chromax Black, they'd be on here already. But we'll see in just a second how well these fans work. Cables here aren't custom, they're off-the-shelf cable mod mesh cables. The lengths work quite well, although since the 3070 FE requires the 12-pin adapter, I just went with the original SF600 cable, and it is concealed pretty well because it's just a short length of that connects to the 12-pin adapter. Cable management is definitely one of those things to plan before everything gets built in. There's not many places to conceal things, and the pump mounting bracket is actually one of those convenient locations to hide a lot of cables. As for the build process, this case is actually very straightforward to build in. The access to the internals is great due to the layout of things. You don't feel cramped at any point in time. You can access the CPU here without having to touch any of the GPU stuff. You kind of build one side and then build the other side, so it's very convenient like that. Since it is a sandwich style case, the one thing that you will want to nail down though as you're planning out your build is where you're going to make the transition from the CPU side to the GPU side. And in one direction, you should just use the radiator as a natural point to bridge over, but the returning connection is trickier, and this could be done through any point where space permits. So this could be done through the top of the case or closer to the bottom, but in my scenario, I had a good spot to kind of tunnel through right here, this near the center divider, and it lined up quite well for the tubing run on the CPU side. So this loop goes from the pump on the GPU side through to the other side, into the CPU block, then from the CPU block into the radiator, back through to this side, and then into this flow meter, that goes into the GPU block, and then finally the GPU block is connected directly to the pump where it returns. So it did have one little hiccup. Initially when I tested it, the FLT 120 pump with the rotary fitting was okay with the glass panel, but once everything was built up with clearances so marginal already, the panel is pushed out a little bit. It's okay for now and it holds, but for an eventual rebuild, I'm going to correct it with a lower profile fitting so that the panel doesn't have any stress on it. And so if you're planning on using this pump and you want to use the surface ports, I definitely recommend getting as low profile fitting as you can for a guaranteed fit. So a male threaded non-rotary 90 is what I would ultimately do. Finally, the POG juice in this build is EK's Cryofuel Solid, and I tinted it with their dye kit. I think it turned out all right. It kind of gives you that tropical feel, right? Of course, I realize it's a pretty personal color choice and it's still early, but operationally so far it's holding up without discoloring any of the acrylic or the nickel components in the build. So how does it perform with just a single 240 rad? Well, with the CPU and GPU completely interdependent now, the expectation is to need higher fan speeds to keep the coolant temp low enough. So for CPU only testing, I did lock the fans at the same 1500 RPM that the Noctua with AIO testing had been running at. Of course, these EK fans come in a good bit louder, about a decibel louder, but with the 5800X locked at a slight all-core OC of 4.7 gigahertz and 1.325 volts, these are very good temps compared to what I've seen with 240 AIOs and this CPU. Two renders here happen back to back since I wanted to get extended testing to get the coolant to hit equilibrium, which it ultimately did at 33 degrees. And the general load temp for the chip levels out at about 72 degrees, of course with that spike at the end due to the way that the Blender Pavilion render typically works. For the next test, I ran Unigine Heaven 4.0 for half an hour, and the coolant hits about 42 degrees at steady state. And of course, custom loops tend to benefit the GPU a lot more, mainly because of the fact that the GPU is now direct die cooled with liquid, and the 3070 reaches a max of about 54 degrees at full load. And then I did ramp up fan speeds to 100% because I wanted an all systems go worst case scenario type of result here. So with the GPU still at 100%, I ran Blender. Of course, now I did back off the CPU clocks a little bit to 4.6 gigahertz on all cores and 1.25 volts since we were already at an overclock. But this is kind of a worst case scenario, and the system can definitely handle this if you need it to. The CPU temps hit about 72, 73 degrees here, and because of the increased fan speeds to handle the load from the CPU, the GPU still manages to stay more or less at the same temp. So that's not a bad performance result. Now this isn't going to be the typical use case for the Meshlicious, and so for that more real world use case, I turned to Red Dead 2 for a gaming benchmark at 1440, now with DLSS, yay, set to quality, and 85 to 90 FPS here, so the CPU is getting a moderate workout. What I did was start out with a minus 60 millivolt undervolt on the GPU, and I dropped the fan speeds back down to about 1300 RPM. And that's kind of funny, right? Now the GPU temp, even at 100% use, is way cooler than the toasty 5800X at 4.7 gigahertz on all cores. Of course, I think these temps are well within the expectation for Ryzen 5000. So with PBO, you might actually find that your board gives it a little bit too much voltage, but you can always fine tune that a little bit with Curve Optimizer for Ryzen 5000. At any rate, the coolant settles in at 42 degrees, and after 15 minutes, I set the GPU back to stock voltage. You'll see that the temps jump right away to about 53 degrees, but because the undervolt was set to a common frequency of about 1900 megahertz, the GPU actually wants to boost faster than that since it's so cool. So the frequency jumped, and since the FPS went up right away, the CPU is getting a little bit more utilization, so that's why you see the jump in the CPU temps as well. So overall, for a gaming build, even with higher power draw components, a single 240 is more than sufficient if you're okay with moderate to moderately high fan speeds. And I definitely go with quieter fans here that also look good. So with this version of the FLT120 being a DDC pump, it is noticeably noisy past about 40% PWM. All testing was done locked to that level, since that's the highest I'd ever consider running a DDC pump during normal use. It's already spinning pretty fast at 3,500 RPM, and despite being only 40% though, it doesn't actually get that much faster, and it only maxes out at 4,500 RPM. So here are a few sound bites of the fans at a few RPM intervals, and then the pump sound for your reference. So while a 280 would allow for slightly lower fan RPMs, I think a good 240 rad plus good fans is absolutely serviceable, and it will give you a more flexible build overall. If you configured an integrated pump, you could get another 240 right here in front of the GPU block, but then it covers up the block. You can try and add a 92 rad up here with a slim fan at the top, but personally my preference is to keep that area for cable management. So I think 1 rad in this system, that's the sweet spot. So if the goal is performance, while the Meshlicious is pretty decent, doing that kind of multiple rad build kind of obfuscates the point of this case, and for me there are better and easier cases to do multiple rad builds where the appearance isn't the prime consideration. And in my mind, where the Meshlicious excels is as a stunning looking gaming build, and I think many of us will agree that the Meshlicious just looks so good due to the visibility of all the components, and there aren't many cases that look this good when displayed. Even though the mesh panel has to be on the CPU side because of the PSU fan, you can still catch a glimpse of the CPU block, and on the other side you can have a sweet looking pump and full view of the GPU block, and it's just such a great layout to display on your desk or as a showpiece. And the thermal performance is just the icing on the cake. For more of a workstation or a productivity build, well, I think it depends ultimately on how much you'll be using both the CPU and GPU at the same time. Obviously, this system can handle that if it needs to, but it's not going to be quiet. And if that's a scenario that you're going to find yourself in regularly, I'd say go for a case that you can get at least another 240 or another 280 in. The other thing is drive mounting for such a build. Well, I could raise the rad a little bit and squeeze an SSD, 2.5-inch SSD under here, but at least with the way I configured the case for the 4-slot GPU width, you do lose the flexibility to mount the drives around and under the power supply. However, now you can mount 2 SSDs at the back of the case here. Now the airflow will change a little bit since these are your strongest ventilation points, but you know, the thought of the extra cabling makes me cringe a little bit, because I think just having M.2s for this build is so much cleaner, and I feel the workstation build just isn't the strong suit here. So if you need a lot of drives, then I'd probably rethink it a little bit. So custom loop, absolutely recommended for this case. Even though it's just 2 fans, the airflow is very straightforward. The layout just has so much aesthetic potential, and soft or hard line with careful planning, you're gonna love it. Hope you found that helpful and enjoyed it. I'm not quite ready to wrap up this series just yet. There are a few more things that I want to test and talk about, but you know, lots more fun content coming up on the Meshlicious. So please give a like, subscribe, and thanks for watching today.